This is part 1 of the Best of 2019 episode of the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome and welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. My name is Ben Catania. I am your host. This is my show, and this is our annual Best of episode. And actually, it is a collection of some of the most memorable and insightful clips that I have tried to weave into some sort of a narrative. And this has meant that I have had to leave a lot of great stuff out. And they say that editing is a bit like killing your babies. It does feel like that. Nonetheless, we've had another year of great episodes with amazing guests and amazing listeners. Thank you for tuning in and for your support. This episode is a bit of a bonus for all of you and a way of saying thank you. The way I've done this episode in the past is I've taken some clips and I've gone big picture first. So some insights from some of our big picture conversations, and I've then tried to drive it into the individual level. And this year I am going to go in the reverse order. For no other reason than why not give it a shot? I'm going to select some clips that start with us as individuals about risk, uncertainty, resilience, and progressively move into the big picture. And we're going to start with fear and my conversation with Hilary Gallo, author of the book Fear Hack.
What we set about to do was to explore fear with a series of exercises. We started it as a thing we call Friday Club, got a few friends together in a room. I ran that for 4 or 5 times. And at a certain point, my co-facilitator needed to go off and do other things. And I was kind of thinking, well, I've done this. And I told the group that of the final workshop that I was going to stop doing it. And their reaction wasn't very good, really. It was that they told me that I had to continue, and that there was a depth in this that was only just starting to emerge. And so I was a bit annoyed at that. So I sat on it for a few months, and then it kept coming back. So I decided to rebirth it, with the fear being very much in the forefront, but also the idea of doing it differently. I wanted to come at this from a kind of the opposite angle than it had ever been come at before, because I kind of had a rebellion against the whole idea of feel the fear and do it anyway. It takes you so far, but I kind of have felt that just telling people just get on with it, stop being so silly,
right, and just face your fears,
crash through it.
Right.
That wasn't working.
Okay.
So I wanted to come at it from a different angle. I didn't fully know what that was, but I had a feeling I wanted to treat fear as my friend rather than fighting it. So I literally wanted to put my arm around it, and so that was the hack. And so I started doing it again, and I started doing public workshops again. And started developing it more, and it's kind of gone on from there as a workshop. And a couple of the exercises have come out particularly strongly. So there's one main exercise I always do, which is about getting people's fears up on the visible on the wall, and I just have found there's an incredible amount of depth in the conversation that comes about when people see, not only people tend to go up to the wall and put their own fear up there.
Yes.
But almost the most powerful thing is when they come back to the wall and see everyone's fears, and you can see sort of things, lights going off, and people seeing something they haven't seen before about what everyone else is feeling, and that we're in this together. There's this kind of conceit that we're kind of alone in our houses with this, and that's crazy because we're all feeling it. And even the coolest person in the room, or the person I'm slightly scared of, is feeling it. And even the people facilitating the workshop, me, I'm feeling it, and we're not always honest about that. And I find when we are, and we do that in a safe environment where we feel we can do that, something amazing happens.
Yes, and I'm curious about this. The hack itself, because let's take, for example, fear of public speaking, which is, I don't know what every survey comes out. So the top fear, second, or maybe above death. Somebody who has to give a talk and they're feeling quite scared. So what's the hack there? So typically you'd get somebody who says, you just have to face your fears, just do it once, and it'll be amazing, or you need to go and confront it. Is that the traditional approach? So what's the hack there?
Well, this is the space in which I'm slightly concerned about having a one size fits all, or even the kind of the book approach. Because at the end of the day, I've learnt that everything is situational and contextual and different. There'll be some consistent patterns, but every situation is different. So that's why the conversation is important, because it's wrong of me to make any supposition about what that experience might be for you, or for anyone else. So what I'm interested in is hearing from the person what it is for them, because there's a difference between the person who has anxiety in the run-up, for example. They worry about it, they don't sleep the night before, compared to the person who actually is fine in the run-up, but once they stand on their own 2 feet, they melt. There's different there's a different approach for each of those people, and then there are many people who have different things from that. So it is incredibly contextual, depending on the particular challenge the person's facing.
But typically, what is fear?
It's a good question.
Where does it come from? What?
That's a very good question. Well, I define fear, so I define it as anything that's going on in the mind, as opposed to if a crazed madman's running towards you in the street with a knife. It's not in the mind. It's
real.
Well, it's kind of in the mind because it's through the eyes and in the optic nerve, but it's kind of a bit more real. And I think that's the interesting border between risk and danger, and managing that, which are more present and real often, than fear, which is a construct of mind. And I've had people in workshops talk about some things that felt very real, like being homeless, or being homeless was a good example, and that felt, oh my God, but it actually, when we talked about it, it wasn't real. The person wasn't homeless. They weren't going to be made homeless. They just had a fear about it. It was in their mind, and they had plenty of strategies for avoiding it, but the fear of homelessness was consuming them to the extent that they were almost willing it to become real.
A theme that consistently arises in this podcast, in my conversations about risk-taking, is knowing what you want, knowing your why, knowing your objective, your goal, whatever it is. And in this next clip with adventurer Luke Tyburski from episode 101, we talk about exactly that.
And I realise there's these recurring things. So now when people say, why, I totally understand why I do what I do now. And
how do you answer that question then?
That's the sole purpose of before I make a decision now is why. And I look at why as two levels, superficial and deep-rooted. So superficial in the purest, especially in this day and age, people think superficial and non-authentic and things like this, but I meant it in the purest sense of the word. It's just sort of stuff on the surface. So if I want to do a challenge, physical challenge, just because no one's ever done it before, that's a superficial reason. Doesn't mean I won't do it, but I put that into the box of that superficial. But in reality, I need some strong, deep-rooted whys. Because when everything goes wrong, when I can't get funding, when I'm injured, and when I've committed to something and I have no idea how I'm going to do it, or when I'm in the actual middle of the challenge and everything goes wrong, and I'm in the trenches, what's going to get me out of there? I tell you what, just because I'm the first person to do it, that gives me an out. No one's ever done it before. I don't have to complete it. I can finish it. So I'm gone. But if I have these deep-rooted whys, then they're the things that are going to give me the energy to push me forward. And I have this quote, and clarity is the eternal energy that fuels your dreams. So if you're so clear and knowing why you want to do what you do, that will give you the energy to push you forward to achieve whatever you want. But you've got to be crystal clear, and it starts with those deep-rooted whys. And the analogy that I'd love to give your listeners is this. What you want to achieve is like a tree trunk. Okay, the superficial whys are the branches and the leaves more specifically. They come and go in the seasons. They look beautiful in the autumn, and also the tree looks amazing in the summer with the green leaves, and they're great. But what happens when it's really windy? Leaves blow away, and they go off, and the seasons change, and they go off, and they come back. But what doesn't change? The roots. They take time to penetrate into the soil, to ground the trunk, to really stay strong. So gale force winds come through, branches come down, leaves disappear, the trunk gets hammered, but the roots are so strong it can weather any storm, and it holds it into the ground. That's your deep-rooted why. So your trunk can get bigger and grow, and the tree can grow, but the branches and the leaves, they'll come and go. They're your superficial why, and the roots are the deep-rooted ones. So whenever I do a big challenge now, I literally will go down with a notepad and go, why am I doing this? Why do I truly want to do this? And if it's all superficial wise, it's all leaves, most of the time, I don't do it. But if there's some really deep-rooted whys that really get me excited, like you can hear it in my voice now, I'm excited to talk about this because it's something that I love speaking about. If I get excited about those deep-rooted whys for a challenge or a business idea or anything, I know that's like, okay, step one is done.
I love that. That's so awesome. I've been thinking a lot about decision making over the last few months, and I haven't landed on the overall approach to my own philosophy, but the first one is to know yourself. The first step. I'm packaging, trying to order my thoughts around decision making, but the first thing is know yourself and your why as you discuss it, because when things do get tough, then it will that the why will see you through.
Yeah, and the other thing that I have is a life philosophy. And Michael Gervais, who spoke about off air, who's Finding Mastery podcast and just very intelligent guy. Him and Pete Carroll, coach of the Seattle Seahawks in the NFL, they work together in numerous ways, and they talk about having it's not a life philosophy, but I think a personal statement. And Pete Carroll challenges people to create that in 25 words or less. And you might think, oh, that's easy. A guiding set of principles or words or sentences of what you live by every single day. Now, when you actually stop and try and write down, how do I want to live my life every single day? Not for business, not for personal, not for like athletic, but your entire life. 25 words, I tell you what, the first time I did it, it took me a whole notebook. I wrote a thesis on it. But over time, I whittled it down. And the great thing is, it can evolve. It's not static. It's not set in stone, and it can evolve over time. And I started doing this probably in 2013, 2014. And right now, where I'm at in life, I've got it down, I think it's 11 words. Okay? It's learn daily and teach others what life has taught me.
let's explore the link between uncertainty, risk, resilience, confidence, and optimism. Here is U.S. Olympian Nicole Davis from episode 112.
Life is organic. We're dealing with other people. There are a lot of variables at stake. Can I adjust? And for me, that thought, no matter what happens, I can adjust and I'll figure it out. And I have what it takes is something that drives confidence. And so I can be in situations where there's unknowns and there's a little bit of risk involved and still lean into it because I'm anchoring to my ability to adjust rather than to perform perfectly. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
And then what's your lens around it? So like, are you pessimistic? So when things don't go as planned, is the first thought, I knew this wasn't going to go as planned, like something bad's going to happen? Or is it like, oh, hell yeah, like what's the next best thing that could possibly happen right now? And so optimism is part of what we would call psychological framework. And I know there's some people listening that when I said optimism, they thought rainbows and ponies and fluffy stuffed animals, and that's not the case. When I think about optimism, I think about special forces operators being dropped into who knows where in the middle of the world, in the middle of the night, and right away things don't go as planned. They've done all of the training. They've done the simulations to prepare. In that situation, do they have the choice to think, well, I knew this wasn't going to go as planned. We're screwed. No, they don't. They don't have that luxury, right? Because their lives are on the line. So for them, it's like, okay, what's the next best option? And so I look at optimism as something that gives us options, the belief that something good is going to happen, right? It gives us options. It keeps us nimble. It allows us to adjust, to stay open to possibilities, to problem solving. And so when I see people who adjust really well, regardless of what's going on, it's because there's a sense that something good could take place and they're able to stay in it for that. And if we look at research around people who are most resilient, they also tend to be high on a scale of optimism. And it's because they're able to shift their attention and their focus when they're in adverse situations to the opportunity in those situations. And they're also able to just approach it with more of a balanced perspective, so that it's not that people who are optimistic, for example, they don't get frustrated or pissed off. They do. Right? But they're able to use a wider range of emotions in managing through those situations, that challenge, that transition, that adversity, so that they can bounce back more easily. So for me, understanding where we derive confidence from. Are your thoughts building confidence? Are they breaking down confidence? What is your lens towards doing difficult things? Like, do you love challenge? When things get really hard, are you like, oh, hell yeah? Or is it like, man, this sucks, we're here again? If that's the case, like, that's a trainable skill as well. And then just going back to this idea of can you be present when you're in the thick of things? Can you just be in it and have a balanced sense of perspective?
Right. That's so interesting. I've always had a kind of visceral sort of reaction to positivity and optimism, right? And when it just doesn't resonate, like, oh, just think positively and everything will work out. It's like, that never kind of works. And I think a lot of my listeners as well, we're also into risk and uncertainty. And so part of us, we like to think about, scenarios of things and, what could go wrong and, that kind of stuff. But what you talk about is like a skill. This is it's actually very practical. So about, shifting, refocusing, getting to option B as quickly as possible, all of that stuff makes perfect sense. So it's quite different from this sort of, as you say, the rainbows and unicorns and stuff, that it's not just hoping that something's gonna, that there's some basis that you're anchoring the optimism to.
That's right. So here's the thing is, like, if you want to anchor to, like, let's say for confidence, I do difficult things. Say that's a thought that generates confidence for you. And then, like, I can be in difficult things and I'll be okay. That's an optimistic thought, right? If you don't do difficult things on a regular basis, you have no reason to believe that. Right. So if you're not getting uncomfortable regularly, then you can't anchor to that thought, So there is a difference between naive optimism and realistic optimism. Right. And I do want to delineate the difference between positive thoughts and productive thoughts. you know, like optimism does not have to be fluffy. In fact, our thoughts that drive confidence, they don't have to feel good either. Like my colleague Courtney, like when things are hard for her, she's like, shit, I'm in it, you know? But that's productive for her.
Right.
Versus, my God, it's just one of those days.
Yeah.
Right? That sounds very different. So the question is like, is it working for you? And if it's not working for you, you are in control of your thoughts, whether you're good at it or not.
Right.
You know, like you have the ability to change the way you think about it and really anchor to a reason why that thought that you're going to is credible and more optimal in that moment, so that you can do difficult things for long periods of time.
Now we have a clip about fear from my conversation with Nadia Finer from episode 103.
I've been trying to kind of unpick it and understand what it is and what I do in that process. I think my fallback position is to run away. I guess it's flight or fight, fight or flight, and you resist things, don't you? You know, your body's going, don't do that, you'd be nuts, why would you do that? Run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. But then I always get this hunch that the thing that I'm hiding from, and I refer to this quote by Joseph Campbell, which I really like, and actually I was thinking about it today, because he said, the cave which you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. And so, I know, whenever I say it makes me go weird and goosebumpy, because I think it's so true. The cave which you're afraid of, the cave holds the answers, and yet that thing, that very exciting opportunity, is scary, and you're resistant to that because you don't want to be in an unsafe position. You don't want to take risks. You want to do this, just keep doing the same old, because you know it will be okay. So once you understand that the scary stuff is in the cave, and that's the exciting thing, and that's where change happens, and good stuff and exciting opportunities. Once you understand that, that's where you have to kind of make a decision, isn't it, to face up to that and lean into it rather than run in the other direction. So when I was feeling really sad about the fact that my business had fallen apart and I'd had this big argument with my business partner and it had all gone pear-shaped, I spent a lot of time soul searching because I obviously hadn't planned for that to happen. You know, I'm the kind of person that lines opportunities up. You know, I have a plan and I'll think, okay, I'll do this, and then the next thing I do will be this other thing, and it's all one thing leading to the next. And in that way, you know, you're never spending weeks on a sofa eating ice cream because you know what's coming. So when the rug was pulled from under me and it all went wrong, I had a lot of time to think, and I realised that for me, at that moment, the scariest thing would have been to embrace my voice and talk openly about it and really kind of lean into it rather than hiding from it. And then it took me a while to convince myself that it would be a good idea. And that actually, no, you know, I was afraid that people wouldn't take me seriously. I was afraid they'd laugh at me, that, you know, that I just wouldn't be able to handle it, that that it would be deeply sweaty and uncomfortable. So it took a while to kind of decide that I would embrace it. And the first thing I did was, rather than creating a brand and being a coach with a random business name, I decided to just be myself and use nadiafiner.com and just be me and have photos of me on the site. But then, you know, beyond that, I knew that I had to do stuff with voice and that I had to embrace it, and that was when I created my kind of tagline, and then the official name of my business, which is A Little Voice, Big Business.
Let's talk human risk. This is from episode 115 with Christian Hunt about Christian's 4th rule of human risk. Number 4 is to change behavior, change the environment, which I really, and I love this quote that you have in the, which is, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower.
Yeah.
And I've never heard of this guy, Alexander de Hare.
No, I must admit, I was looking for. I always try and find, quotes. I think are great at sort of things. And if somebody said it better than I could say, it, right, let's just borrow what they've said. So this guy does is kind of he's a sort of thought leader around organizational effectiveness, personal development, all that sort of space. And I just love that piece. And it's basically saying, we often fixate on people, and we identify, particularly in the
try and fix people,
right? And you go, the problem is bad people, these terrible people here. We need to reprogram the people, and you kind of go, well, people are responding to the environment they're in, and we all know that intuitively that we respond to what's going on around us. And I think when you get cases of sort of wrongdoing, if I look at in the UK, we had a big thing about politicians' expenses, big scandal. Do I think every single person going into politics is evil? I mean, it's an interesting time to be having this discussion, right? Given the chaos that's going on in the UK at the moment.
But not every single one.
But I think there's an environment that promotes this sort of thing, and I think all too often it's very convenient to be able to turn around and tell a story that the reason this has happened is it's a bad person, and we have dealt with the problem by reprogramming or extremists firing the bad person. Yeah. We don't like to accept actually it's an environment, and particularly for organisations, it's tough to turn around and go, "You've created this." Right, and so I think we should start by looking and saying, what is it when something goes wrong? What is it in the organisation's architecture, and I mean both physical and sort of control and culture and everything else, that has facilitated this sort of behaviour from happening? Yeah. That's not to say that we excuse people who do terrible things, but if we start from the premise of whenever something goes wrong, someone does something silly or bad, that it's automatically 100% down to them, you miss the opportunity to kind of correct it. And actually, but that's why I like the flower analogy particularly, because if you're growing weeds rather than flowers, if you don't fix the environment, you're just going to have more and more weeds. And so if you've got people responding to the environment and you don't fix the environment, but you might get rid of or reprogram that one person, but someone else is going to come along and react in the same way.
Because the incentive structure will be the same or whatever.
Right.
I liken this to things like insider trading or doping in sport or corruption. And if the environment is there, the incentives are there, then you're going to get more of the same type of behavior. It's just other people will do it.
And it's that sort of, we all know that if there's sort of you go to a sort of area, there's lots of graffiti there. If it's acceptable to if that becomes a prevalent thing, more people will do it. And so fixing this environmental piece is critical. And we very often kind of focus on bad people. And there's a really good book by a guy called Professor Yuval Feldman, who's a behavioural lawyer, and he's written a book called The Law of Good People. And what he basically says is, look, we should stop fixating on writing rules for bad people, because if you're really bad, you're going to do stuff anyway, right? So these attempts to control you, if you really are genuinely evil or intent on doing something, it's going to be hard to control you from doing that. And what we need to do is we need to maximise the environment for the good people and focus on how do we stop good people who, for a variety of reasons, be it that they're cognitively depleted, maybe they've got a moral blind spot on something, maybe you've just given them a situation where it's tempting for them to do something. We've got to kind of focus on those people, because the really bad guys and girls are going to do this anyway. And so this idea of kind of let's look at the environment and how it impacts the majority of our people who want to do the right thing. And I always find it astonishing. Organisations sort of, on the one hand, they spend loads of money hiring people, and then they behave as if every single one of their employees is untrustworthy. And it's it's not to say that everybody is 100% trustworthy, but it's to say how can we think about avoiding situations where we drag otherwise good people into situations that are bad, and that's all around environmental cues that we take.
So would you say things like we talked about a little bit about incentives, I suppose, what other people do, what are some of the other things?
So look, you copy other people. So if for example, there's a rule in the organisation that says, that you I don't know, let's take a particularly bad organisation that says you must be here until 6 o'clock on the dot, right? And everybody slopes off at 5:30. Everybody will start doing that. So you copy the behaviour of other people, and in what you do, you take cues from, just sort of your perception of the environment, and perception is really important. So I will sort of infer what a standardised behaviour is. So the best example of this is when you go travelling, go to a country you've never been to before. How do you work out which restaurants to go to? How do you work out what people to tip? How do you work out, can you cross the road when the lights are red? Well, the answer is you just watch other people and you copy them. And that's what, nightclubs exploit this. So there's a reason they artificially create those lines outside, totally unnecessary, but it sends a signal, something called social proof. You go, oh, this, subconsciously, there's loads of people standing there, so must be a good thing to go to. They have to do that because you can't see inside the nightclub by default. So they create it outside. Restaurants will will seat people by the window to make it look like they're busier than they actually are. So there's lots of examples, and it makes perfect sense, right? But sometimes it doesn't. And so we have to just be conscious of these particular dynamics that are there, and we can transmit messages to people in interesting ways. So one of the things that I found was that if you've got a lot of people breaching a particular policy within an organisation, so behaviour you don't want, often the response is, let's send an email out to everybody and remind them of the policy, which is a logical response. So they're not doing it, so I'm going to remind them. But of course, actually what you're doing with that is potentially quite bad, because if you send an email to everybody saying, and I had this, I was given an email to send, and they like heads of compliance to send their emails because it comes with authority. Right, so send this email out saying the executive committee is highly concerned by the large number of violations of this policy, this is unacceptable. Right, and so the idea being we'll remind people and then they'll behave. But of course, actually what that does is people that are following the rule will receive an email, right? And they'll go,
why am I following this?
Your best case scenario is they're irritated because you're patronising them on something they do. Your worst case scenario is they go, well, they wouldn't send that email out, and they sure as hell wouldn't reference the executive committee if it wasn't a widespread thing. Why am I being good here when everybody else is being bad? And of course, then to the people that have breached the rule, what you've said to them is, hey, don't worry, you're not the only one, because clearly they wouldn't be sending this email out if it wasn't a widespread issue. So you're in good company. So the message we're subliminally transmitting to everybody is there is widespread non-compliance. Now, there are ways you can, so one of the techniques though is to not make any references to the breaches and find a helpful way. So I reworded it and sent it in a more helpful manner that kind of that made it sound like we were being supportive. People actually came and said, thank you, that was a really helpful email. It wasn't, it was a patronising reminder of the rules, but it was framed in a different way. But actually you start to look at it and go, okay, well, if all these people are doing that, why are they doing it? And this is back to the environmental piece. Well, the answer is you go and have a look at the rules and say, why is it? Is there a good reason why people aren't complying with this rule? And the answer often is, it's really hard, it's not clear, the training's terrible, the rule, it's 500 pages worth of stuff you need to read, and it's silent on the big issue.
Up next is a great clip from my conversation with Alex Hutchinson, who wrote the fantastic book about human endurance, Endure.
Yeah, I mean, I had a chance, 12 or 13 years ago to spend some time with a runner named Joseph Duritu. I was working for a newspaper in Ottawa, and so I pitched to them as like, hey, we know the Ottawa Marathon is coming up. You know that some Kenyan runners are going to come here and they're going to win the race. But nobody really knows anything about them. Before they come, why don't you send me to spend some time with one of them, a guy who's won in years past, and figure out who he is and what his story is. And so I really got a chance to spend some time with this guy, and it was just amazing. You sort of know the cliches about they're coming from poverty and money can be transforming, but just to hear in specific detail about this guy's life and how he he wasn't a runner. He was working as a manual laborer. He heard on the radio one year that some Kenyan guy named Eric Wainana had come third at the Olympics. And he thought, man, I used to race that guy when I was in elementary school. I bet I'm as fast as him. So he quits his job and goes and spends 3 years training as a runner with he hasn't been running since he was a kid. He spends 3 years, so he's got no money. His parents are taking care of his kids. He's living in a grass hut. After 3 years, finally he can't get to any races. He doesn't have the money for a plane ticket or anything. An agent hears, a guy he knows tells a guy he knows that this guy might be ready to travel overseas. So a guy buys him a plane ticket. An agent buys him a plane ticket. He comes over to Canada, runs a bunch of races, goes home after 8 weeks with $400. Now, if you're he's living on the floor of an apartment with 16 Kenyan runners, for someone like me who was in Canada racing these races, it's not, I had to have a job. It's not sustainable for me. But for them, they lived cheap enough. He went home with $400, and that was life transforming. They bought the first ever cow for milking in their family, and and the next year he came back with $1,000 and was able to buy basically a farm. And so it's like,
absolutely,
you realize it's like, okay, yeah, that's a different level of life transformation. And this guy is on the sort of fourth tier of runners. He's not winning the Olympics. Yep. He's winning the Joe's 5K in a small town in Ontario, and he's racing twice a weekend. Every weekend for 8 weeks. So anyways, a bit of a digression, but it's
super interesting.
World.
And then on the flip side, I was thinking about there's no shame in blowing up if you're a Kenyan, whereas perhaps there might be if you're an elite runner. And it reminds me of a couple of things. One was something that I heard Malcolm Gladwell talk about on his podcast, and he obviously wrote the foreword to Endure, and that was about when to pull the goalie in hockey.
Oh yeah,
that you should, that teams should do that way earlier than they do, but they don't, because once you start doing that, then 3-0 becomes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it looks bad. But if you're losing, you're losing. And it's similar to I spoke to Annie Duke, who's this World Series of Poker champion, and she wrote a book on decision making and thinking in bets, and the social pressures of doing something unconventional, even though it's the smart thing to do, is quite acute. So
yeah,
probably
that's a great analogy. I mean, the pulling the goalie, it's like, why don't you pull the goalie? It has nothing to do with optimizing your chances in the game, and everything to do with how
it looks.
Yeah, exactly. Not sort of embarrassing yourself or whatever.
Yeah. And so I suppose from a downside perspective, Kenyan runners will just say, well, I blew up, and that, oh yeah, you did too. So did I last week or whatever.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing, like in that 15 years ago when I was running these races, I would sort of be snickering behind my hand, like as that, I would 12 Kenyan runners would go out way in front of me, and I would catch half of them. And as the ones I'd passed, I think, that guy was an idiot. Why was he a minute in front of me at the halfway mark, and then I blew his doors off last half? It's like, but next week he blew my doors off, and I was, next week he was first, and last week he was 20th. I was 12th both times, and it's better to be first once and 20th the other time than to be 12th over and over and over again. But I didn't kind of clue into that.
Yeah, and it's the same in all kinds of sport, right? There's going for it on fourth down in American football, third down, I guess, in Canadian football, and that again, more teams should do it than they do, but they don't because of perception and all that stuff. So it's super super interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say this is as the rise of the era of analytics has started to change that in some of the team sports where you can see it's like, no, really, the onside kick really does help, or whatever whatever the case may be. That doesn't convince everybody, right? Like you can show people stats, all day long, and they might still say, yeah, but I still don't want to do that. So it's interesting to see that culture clash, and and how it sort of manifests in different sports.
Did you know that there is a safe way to set someone on fire? This next clip comes from our conversation with Anna Glover and Bryan Huneycutt about risk in technical theater, which is absolutely fascinating and filled with a number of transferable lessons. Here are a couple.
And the funny thing is, when you talk about setting someone on fire, looking at all of the things that we've done in the parks over the years, setting someone on fire was one of the statistically safest things that we have ever done from a performance standpoint.
Really?
If I look at injuries of other things and how people have gotten hurt over the years, we had a show called Lights, Motors, Action where one of the performers crashes a motorcycle through a wall of fire, gets up, now they're on fire, and we put them out. We're going to do that multiple times per day. And everyone said yes to that. So much like Anna's experience with that is there's a safe way to light people on fire. And I love saying that sentence because people immediately go, you just said there's a safe way to light people on fire. There are very few OSHA codes related to lighting people on fire. It is frowned upon. But stopping and looking back at the work that goes into something like that, the checklists about the dressing procedures, all of the things that have to be done correctly and checked and double checked to get to that tiny moment. So much like the rocks, that's a small moment that happens, a very dramatic moment, but if we do our jobs correctly, the audience goes, wow, that was amazing, and never understands the level of work that goes into that moment.
I think the thing that I love about the industry we work in is we work with problem solvers. And the reason that we can do the job we do is because when you set someone on fire or you drop rocks from the ceiling, the hazard is obvious. So we're all working on that. Sometimes then that means that the things around the outside of that we maybe don't pay as much attention to, and because they don't seem to be, I'm talking about perhaps wellness, people's working hours and everything that goes into that. But we're really good at creating these absolutely incredible things. I mean, I've part of the career I had working with the company that produced Warhorse, there was a moment where we had an actor run and take a jump onto a puppet horse that was held up by two other people and then canter across the stage and then get shot at and fall off the horse. That's the sort of thing that we can make happen. And we have to do that in front of a live audience where it's really hard to hide all of the, I'd love to do some work in the movies sometimes, but my understanding of the little work I have done in the movies is that it's easier to hide things. You can have multiple takes, you can also have shots out of camera. You don't get that in theatre. It's, unless you're really careful with being creative with the wings, and more creative artists now are exposing the bones of the theatre in their shows. I'm seeing a real upsurge of this. So you lose that wing space, you lose that ability to hide. So it's like asking someone to do the most complicated magic trick and show off at the same time exactly how that magic trick is happening and still have the audience go, wow, how did you do that? And that's the people that we work with. I mean, that's what makes the job so amazing.
That's fascinating, and you can feel the passion come out when you guys describe that. So at the same time, I'm sure you've had incidents when things have gone wrong. What do you do when something goes wrong? What's whether it's mindset, maybe I'm not sure what example you can provide. You don't have to provide one, but is there something that you kind of do that?
I think the most important thing when looking at those moments when things don't go the way we had planned them is taking into account the decision-making process that got you to the moment.
Okay.
And really looking and being willing to open that decision-making process back up and break things down. I think too often we look at a situation, we assign blame, whether that blame be a person, a situation, a choice, and we stop. Once we have found the culprit, we stop looking. And anybody who's ever had a flat tire, and then you think you've taken care of the situation, and then you find out that it wasn't just that one hole, it was 16 others. I think we too often do that. We solve what we think the problem is, but we don't exhaust all of the other possibilities and walk back. Kind of from a butterfly effect standpoint, have I really gotten to the root cause of that situation? In one of our earlier sessions today, you talked about 5 why. Are we going through that kind of process? yes, this person made that decision. Why did they make that decision? Did they have the information they needed in that moment? Did we train them correctly? Is our training built to account for that moment? Did we see that moment? And if we didn't, why didn't we see that moment? Could we have foreseen those? So really being able to dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper and just completely exhaust those. And I think, too often, and safety professionals included, I think too often we go, yep, this is what the cause was. Look at that. All right, we have now mitigated this. Let's move on. Yay for us. And we forget that there could be other things that led up to that. Very seldom is there a singular cause to any incident. There is usually a moment that happened that set a series of events in place that eventually led up to that specific incident. So have we walked back far enough in the moment to really understand the core root cause to what happened?
Yeah.
And no matter how small that incident was, we still need to walk back.
Let's discuss some techniques on decision making. Here's Alex Sidorenko.
Into switching into a more sensible state, and then we start seeing things that were not obvious to us. And for that, I have 3 tools which are just absolutely amazing. The first one is actually borrowed from CIA. It's called Key Assumptions Check. And that's a technique that I hope every single human being applies in any situation that is of consequence. So if it's important enough, use that technique. The idea is very simple. Key Assumptions Check basically means decompose what are some of the assumptions or inputs or requirements for your decision to be a success are, find out what those assumptions are, and then ask yourself a question. Is this assumption valid? Is it still valid? Where is it coming from? Do I trust the source? Is it reliable? Am I not just blindly following the blind? Is this information actually, verifiable? And to our surprise, most of the time when we do that, we realize that our decisions are actually made on fairy tales that nobody ever checked. I mean, the funniest thing I heard was at the recent conference in US was military, when they started challenging some of the assumptions that were built into their models, into their decision frameworks, they found assumptions from First World War. Not Second World War, First World War.
Right.
Somebody put it there, and everybody just blindly followed because nobody bothered to check that it still holds true. Obviously, it didn't, because it's 100 years old. And that's the first technique. The second technique is called scoring, and that's basically whenever we have a number of choices, we have to. A piece of paper is the best risk management instrument we have. It's unbelievable. I mean, my wife hates me for doing that. I make her draw everything on paper, and I do that as well for personal decisions. I mean, we were choosing recently. We were choosing a place for our daughter's 6th birthday, and we had so many different options. And it was impossible to make a decision in our mind until we put it on the paper, list all the options, and then determine a criteria, and just go plus minus, and what are the different risks and what are the different positive things for each of the alternatives. And when you map out the alternatives in such a very simplistic way, I mean, it takes 5 minutes. When you do that, suddenly the decision becomes much, much clearer. And this is, these 2 techniques, Key Assumptions Check and scoring, these are all very kindergarten techniques. Yeah. And then the final one, which we use for serious decisions, is of course using scenarios and simulations. If we need to quantify something, then we usually build a very simple model, and we try to quantify what the future may look like. And here's the kind of the secret sauce. The future, and this is my favorite quote, the future is plural. That means there are always multiple futures. There's no one perfect world scenario that will happen. There are always a multitude of possible scenarios. And that's why when we're trying to quantify future, we use scenarios and we use ranges. That's why no good risk manager on the planet would ever talk about deterministic values. They would never say something is an X, or 5 million or 7 million, 3. We always talk about ranges, and we always talk about ranges and confidence intervals. That means I'm saying sending kids to school will cost me between 5 and 7,000 euros 90% of the time. That means 5% of the time it may cost me less, and 5% of the time it may cost me significantly more. But that's again, this is very uncommon for humans to, instead of going for a single deterministic future, talk about possible ranges and apply confidence interval, saying, I'm only 30% confident that this is the future that will be. And there's a 70% chance that it will be completely different to what I expect.
Let's continue on this decision-making theme. Here's a clip from my conversation with Allison Schrager, author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel. That's from episode 120.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. When I started the book, I started with the finance, like what financial concepts are so important. And I sort of had this whole outline, and then I took it to Robert Merton, who is one of the creators of Black-Scholes. And just to be like, do you think this is, how I should be thinking about risk, Bob? Do if we're gonna spread the message to the whole population, what should be in here? And he was like, it starts and ends with risk-free. Like risk-free is the sort of what all financial models are built off of. You start with risk-free and you see, is that enough to get my reward? And if it's not, then you have to take risk. And that also, what risk-free gives you also tells you exactly how much risk you need to take. So there's this fundamental building block of all financial relationships. And if you look at any complex financial models, no matter what they are, there's always a risk-free rate in there. Black-Scholes, Sharpe ratios, all this stuff. So, and not only that, if you just think about, that's in finance, but if you think about risk-free in everyday decisions, it's actually a very useful concept because it helps you clarify what your goal is. Like no matter what, this is true in either for financial planning or just any daily decision. If you're clear on what you're taking a risk for, you're much more likely to have a successful risk. Like it really is astounding, like all the fancy stuff you can do. But if you just are very clear on what your objectives are, it makes such a big difference. And the handy thing about risk-free is it helps you clarify that.
Right. So this is about, if I was to try to translate some of this for someone who doesn't understand or has never taken a finance course, then you would define what's non-negotiable?
I wouldn't say it's not non-negotiable. It is actually what gets you what you want with no risk.
Okay.
So, for example, if you have $100 and you want to make sure you still have $100 in a month, the risk-free asset would be like a government T-bill. It's a certain rate of return. Nothing's going to happen to it. So that would be the risk-free asset. $100 now will be $100 in 6 months.
Right.
But the tricky thing is about risk-free, and one of the reasons it's so useful is it clarifies your goal. So suppose your goal is $1,000 in 20 years. A T-bill doesn't really offer you that because inflation risk, say, $1,000, you don't know what inflation is going to be over the next 20 years. So you need a different asset. You need like a 10-year or 20-year inflation protected security for that to be risk-free. So depending on your goal, you have a different risk-free asset. And that is also true of just like anything. Like suppose, you're considering what to do for the evening and you could go to a party or you can stay in and watch Netflix. So like, what's your goal? Is your goal to just have a pleasant evening? Well, Netflix is pretty pleasant, probably better than a lot of parties. But is your goal to meet a new person? Like in which case, Netflix is not your risk-free asset. You're never going to meet anyone staying at home watching TV. You have to go out. So as I said, you can see, what risk-free is for your goal. And of course, even if pleasant evening is your goal, Netflix is the risk-free option, right? You know how that's going to go. But there's also not a lot of upside, right? Like, it's going to be good. But I mean, a night in with Netflix is rarely amazing. So even if your goal is fun, the party has more downside risk, but it also has a lot of upside. And like it could be a really fun party.
Right. So
does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's about knowing what you want. And therefore, if you have a child and my risk-free is I want my child to go to college or something like that, then you can kind of plan your life around those concepts.
Yeah, well, I guess it's whether, I guess that's also a complicated thing. Is your goal, even you have to narrow it down, financing them to go to college, like so they have enough money, or raising a child who wants to go to college and has the intellectual sort of tools to do that?
Here's another take on purpose and on the benefits of quitting. This is from episode 108 with adventurer Katie Jane Lerpinière.
I'm quite good at suffering, and it's suffering that is by choice. But I just a really a simple example. I was recently crossing the French Alps with my friend. We were kind of fast packing, hiking, but quickish. And she was just in a low state, and we all get in those low states. And she couldn't think of anything else, and I didn't understand how she couldn't kind of, I'm like, well, I don't know, think what you'd like for dinner, and we'll make sure we find like a really good place where we can have a steak if that's what you want. And she just couldn't take herself somewhere else. She couldn't not think of the pain. She couldn't not get angry with the pain. And I'm quite good at accepting, even if I'm crying, that's why I say ignore the crying, because that's irrelevant. That's just a bodily function that's uncontrollable. But with my mind, I find it, even if I'm really hurting or it's pouring down with rain, I can just kind of be quite acceptant that this is what situation is, and it will pass in time, and not to let it get to me. And I didn't really know I had that until I see other people who struggle with that, and then I think, oh, that's quite a useful skill in these instances.
That is, and it's probably something that we can all develop. But you said something that I quite liked, which is it will pass with time. And I think that's great.
Everything passes with time.
Yes. If you just keep moving, it will, things will pass. That's a great lesson.
On the flip side, if you were to quit, the time would have still passed. So that time would have come when you'd have finished if you hadn't have quitted. And then you'll be very upset that you didn't. So yeah, just not to get angry with things that you can't control. Obviously, sometimes we make mistakes, and it's very difficult to not be angry with yourself in those instances. But if you're in a gale or you're in a storm or your blisters are bad and you've done all the taping you can do to your feet, you just have to accept you can't do anything about it and think about something else. So yeah.
Great lesson. Yeah. We've jumped around a bit, which is cool. I'm very cool with that. But you did have an Instagram post that I quite liked, which was the one actually around, speaking of quitting, you did have one about quitting, and I'd be just, that we're on the topic, I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
So this is my most recent adventure, January of this year. It was the worst week and the best week of my life in a really weird, the southernmost tip of Europe, in Spain, with the intention of running 7,000 kilometers to Nordkapp in the northernmost point of Europe, in the top of Norway. And everything about the trip was wrong. I didn't realize this, honestly, until I set off. In fact, I realized it when my mum came to collect me, to drop me at the airport, and it was all wrong. I could just feel it in my tummy that it was wrong, but I convinced myself it was just nerves, and you'll be fine when you get going, and off you go. And so I started the journey. The plan was for the first 3 weeks to do average a marathon a day, and then go up to about 50 kilometers a day to cover the distance. I was carrying everything on my back, so it was running's probably not the best term, because it was more of a shuffle.
It was a hike, right.
I was in running kit, and I did run, but it was you can walk probably the same pace because of the weight of the pack. But I was only out there for 6 days, and I managed the, I averaged a marathon a day. I actually unknowingly broke my foot on day 3. I heard it go, and the pain was immense, but I actually convinced myself that it was my mind playing tricks on me, wanting an excuse to stop, because I was hating it so much that I was telling myself, no, you haven't injured yourself. That's just the part of you that's not liking this, trying to find a way out. And so I convinced myself that I was fine, not that I'd broken my foot. I managed 48K on it the day that I did it, and then 2 marathons after that. But it just wasn't for me. And I've never quit anything in my life. Sometimes things go wrong and you injure yourself, or, you get ill and you can't finish what you started, and that hurts and it's hard. There's no pretending it's not hard. It's hard to deal with because you put your heart and soul into these things. But this was just a pure not wanting to be there, not wanting to do it. I was actually getting quite angry. I felt like I was wasting days of my life and wasting hard-earned money being miserable, and that's not what it's all about. So on day 6, I just said, that's it. I'm going home, after 6 days of what's supposed to be a 7-month expedition. And really strangely, it wasn't a hard decision. I was happy. I never thought quitting anything could be so easy. But it's just because it was so wrong for me. And the reasons I was there were wrong. Some massive, massive errors. I don't know if it was a midlife crisis because I'm 40 this year, or I just got caught up in this current social media world where we are completely constantly comparing ourselves to each other. But I think subconsciously, I kind of thought, years gone by, I was competitive on the horses. I did very well. I then went on to modelling, which is, quite cool. And then before I knew it, I was doing world first expeditions, and I was on TV couches talking about them, and guests on cooking programs, and speaking to big corporate companies around the world. And then I kind of thought, gosh, are my best days done? But I didn't know this was my thought process. It was very clear when it came to me, but before the trip, and I had convinced myself that I needed to do something massive. I needed to do another world first. No woman has run across Europe, and I made that mistake. Now, it's so obvious when I look back at the things I have done that happen to be records or happen to be first. I didn't know that when I chose the trip. When I decided to go to the Great Wall of China, it's just because I really wanted to go to the Great Wall of China, and the record was completely a secondary thing, as where this was the wrong way round. I was running along the dual carriageway, hard shoulders of dual carriageway. I was passing daily kind of cafes with English fried breakfast on the menu, and
not quite an adventure in the same sense.
Yeah, and I'm all about being as far away from human beings as possible, and I love the element of looking after yourself on a primal level that you can only really get when you're in a really remote part of the world. And I was just running along what is lovely for a holiday, but the Costa Brava and things on the coast of Spain, and that just wasn't floating my boat. And I now realize how I just got sucked in by feeling like I had to, social media is wonderful and I love it, but every day I look at Instagram and I'm so inspired by all the incredible people doing incredible things, but you also think, oh gosh, do I need to be doing that? Do I need to be and no, I don't. But at that moment in time, I thought I did. And I am really, really happy I did that week, because it made me really realize that that's not what it's about. I never had an answer. That's not right. And I won't ever let that happen again.
Adventures and risk-taking can take many forms, as you will hear in the final clip of part 1 of the best of, from episode 106 with Usman and Adeela Omar.
Just to simply put it, we want to set up an online boutique to ethically source all these artistic products from different underprivileged regions of Pakistan. And why I say underprivileged regions is because I've personally visited all these different remote areas of Pakistan, especially in Sindh, and they're basically living in a very they're living below poverty line, and it's just a very underprivileged community that they have, and the work that they're creating doesn't get that much exposure, and so they aren't really, exposed to better opportunities. And so through this, on setting up this online boutique, we want to give especially women in those regions that opportunity to market and sell their products, which they handcraft, and which takes about them, it could take from 15 days to over a year. So there's a variety of products that we would want to introduce, but initially there's a very particular a product that they create. It's a very intricate pattern designed blanket or a quilt, or you could say a duvet, which we use here. So these women in these different regions of Pakistan, they take recycled cloths and they stitch everything together and just have this preconceived design in their minds, and they just pour it out all on this sheet of fabric. And it might not be a canvas, because we're very used to a traditional piece of art, which is painting on canvas. That would be considered as art, but I think it's their way of expressing art and what's really in their mind and expressing their creative side with just this piece of fabric. So they're very intricate designs, and that's why a lot of the time, like what I experienced over there is that people come and collect they buy these products from different parts of Pakistan, but the artisans who are creating these, they are not given their worth or the value of their work. And so, I really want to introduce it to a wider market, and especially in just having access to, just starting off in London, hopefully people would admire and appreciate the amount of hours that really go into this piece of work, and just the amount of effort as well that goes into this. Yeah.
All right, that's the end of part 1. Part 2 will be out within the next 48 hours. Until then, have a wonderful new year. And as I always say, don't forget, risk is life.